These are the Mentasta Mountains, that is the Mentasta Lake, that is Fish Creek, where when I go home and I take my shoes off and I step into that water and my soles are to soil with the water rushing around my ankles and I look to the mountains and I feel the wind in my hair, I know who I am. And I'm very blessed to be able to do that with my mother's people because I don't have the same opportunities with my father's people. Our reservation in Pawnee, Oklahoma is where we were removed to from the Nebraska-Kansas areas in 1876. My relatives left the Nebraska area and walked to what is now the Pawnee Reservation in Oklahoma. So whenever I get the chance to go back to Nebraska, I do that same thing. I take off my shoes, I put my feet to the earth, and I stand there and let the vibrations of the earth and the connections to who I am and to that place refresh me, ground me, and remind me of who I am and who I am responsible to. So today I'm going to share with you those stories about who I'm responsible to, my relation to not only my family, my community, but the entire group of Indigenous peoples here in the United States. So welcome to my land, welcome to my story, and I look forward to talking story with you. I told the folks earlier, right before we got on this call, that I changed several times what I was going to talk about. Very often when people look at my resume, they expect me to put up some very, technical slides about the research that I'm doing. They want to know about the recent data that we've released on COVID-19 or whatever it is. And I often struggle with that because telling and talking story in that way is actually something I'm not comfortable with. It's something that I've had to teach myself in order to be taken seriously in Western environments. So one of the things I've had to learn how to do is to walk into a group of scientists and immediately began to establish myself and talk about myself as an expert. And that is super weird for me. It's very uncomfortable. I think it should be unnecessary, but unfortunately, as a result of the institutional and structural racism that exists in the world, when a Native woman walks in, when a brown, Indigenous, Black person of color walks into a scientific room, we automatically have to begin to prove that we have the right to be there. Our knowledge systems aren't often respected. Our way of talking story often doesn't make sense in that world. And as a result of that, we're often disregarded when we begin to tell the stories of our ancestors, when we tell about our connection to our land. And as a result of that, for many years, I would walk into rooms and assert myself as a Western scientist. And when I would walk out of those rooms, it was almost like my spirit was being crushed. It was a very difficult and anxiety-ridden time for me. And I was sitting with one of my relatives, and he had recently given a presentation, and he had come to see me. And as I was sitting with this loved one, this uncle who had been part of raising me, and he was sitting next to me, and I really wanted him to tell me what a great job I had done. He leaned over and he said to me, he said, "You don't talk Indian anymore." And it almost like broke my heart. It took me about 2 to 3 years to really think about what he had said to me. And I realized that when my uncle, my relative, came to this academic presentation that I was giving at a university, I spoke like a Western academic. I put up the PowerPoint slides, I talked over the data, I talked about our people as data points and not as loved ones. And I had allowed myself to become part of a system that was slowly killing me and was killing my spirit. And my uncle, in that one statement, as our elders do, he reminded me that I wasn't speaking Indian anymore. And in those few words, he directed me on the right path. So today, I'm going to share with you all of who I am as an Indigenous person, as a Pawnee woman, as an Athabascan woman, and I'm going to tell you the story of my organization. My organization is the Urban Indian Health Institute. We are one of 12 tribal epidemiology centers located across the country serving federally recognized tribes. Mine is unique in that we focus on the urban dwelling American Indian and Alaska Native population, which is approximately 70% of all American Indians and Alaska Natives live in large urban settings across the United States for a variety of reasons. So it is my responsibility to ensure that they are represented in the data and ensuring that evaluation efforts capture their voices and that research is done in a culturally appropriate way. And right now, I'm in the midst of fighting for my people in this time of COVID to ensure that the resources that they need are allocated to them. And it's an incredible blessing, and one that I didn't expect to be in. So I am a sister, I am an auntie, I am a mother, I am a wife, I am a granddaughter. And here are some of my sisters and my nieces, not all of them. I have 7 siblings, and I have 9 nieces and nephews. But my siblings and I have a very close relationship. And one of the things that we do in my family is that when somebody makes major life decisions, we do that together. So I had spent many years working in universities in Washington State. I was doing really well. At the time, when I thought about taking the job I'm in right now, at the time I was a director of one of the largest American Indians Alaska Native research centers in the country, Partnerships for Native Health. I had a great job. I had a great salary. It was pretty easy in the sense that, you know, as a Native academic, it's never real easy. You're always fighting some battle for Indigenous knowledge, but I was in a good place. I was approached by the CEO of the Seattle Indian Health Board, where I'm the chief research officer now and the director of the Urban Indian Health Institute. And she approached me with this position. She asked me, she said, you know, I know that you like your job at the university, but would you come and consider being with us at the Urban Indian Health Institute and directing that? And I brought it to my family. Truthfully, I originally didn't think it was going to be the best move, but after several weeks of praying about it, of talking amongst the family, it was decided that it was going to be in the best interest of our community for me to take this position at the Urban Indian Health Institute. So I left a good job with a good wage, good retirement benefits, and I quit that job and stepped into an Indigenous nonprofit in Seattle, Washington. So when I walked into my office for the very first time, I knew that I had made the right decision. And that is because for 1.5 years prior to my new job, I had been having a dream. And this dream would come to me when I was asleep. It had been happening for almost 2 years. And in this dream, I would see a black file cabinet. And there was really nothing else in this dream. And I would actually have to quiet myself in the dream. I would have to quiet my spirit. I would have to sit and listen. And in the times that I sat and listened in this dream with a black file cabinet, I could hear soft weeping. And I knew in my heart it was the cries of women. I didn't know what it meant. I talked to my elders. I talked to my spiritual leaders. I talked to my family. My husband kept telling me, quit telling me this boring dream, nothing happens. But I knew it was important because my mother always taught me that we were to listen to our dreams. And as an Athabascan and Pawnee person, I was raised to know that it is one way that the spirits and the ancestors communicate with us. When I walked into my office that very first day at the Seattle Indian Health Board, Urban Indian Health Institute, surrounded by the love of these loved ones you see in this picture right now, when I walked in, the very first thing I saw sitting in a corner was a black file cabinet with a purple sticker on the bottom drawer. It was the file cabinet of my dreams. It is what I had been seeing for almost 2 years. It is where I had heard the soft weeping of Native women. This was the purple sticker that was on that drawer. And when I opened that drawer and found what was a solitary file, very small file within that drawer, it was the result of a study that had been done in the city of Seattle with American Indian and Alaska Native women. It was a study that had been done that asked about, for the very first time, this had never been done nationwide, it asked about the rates of sexual violence against urban Indian women dwelling within one city. And the results of this study had been sitting in that drawer for more than 1.5 years. And those women had been calling to me that whole time. So why were they calling to me? It was because the decision to not release that information was made by non-Indigenous people, specifically by men, to not release that information because they believed it would be stigmatizing to Native women. But yet I had heard those women calling to me for more than 1.5 years. And I know I heard those voices because I am a survivor of sexual violence also. And I have spent many, many years going through the healing process in order to serve my people well and to overcome the trauma that was a direct result of the historical trauma enacted against my people, including the inability of my parents to have my sexual assault investigated or tried, because what they told my parents is that it happened on Indian land and you're just Indian people. It took many years to be able to overcome that experience, which is one very common for Native women across this country who are sexually assaulted on tribal lands where the laws are different. And in that healing process for many, many years, my parents, myself, and I had been on this journey. And as a result of those healing practices, I know I heard these voices, these women calling me. And that was my responsibility. It was my relationship to them. Here at the Urban Indian Health Institute, when we think about data, we don't think about it as data points. We don't think about it as something stored on our servers or something that we don't allow people access to. We think about data as voices. We think about data as a storyteller. Each person within our research data or evaluation data is a storyteller. And we have a responsibility to the storyteller and to the story. And I am blessed to have been raised at the feet of my elders, hearing stories day after day after day, night after night after night, traditional stories, modern stories, one that taught me. And my elders have taught me that when we hear stories, with that comes responsibility. My organization, and now I had the responsibility for stories that had been stored in a file cabinet of Native women who had sat in interviews that were more than 4 hours long, telling their deepest, darkest traumas of being sexually assaulted. They shared those stories for one reason. They shared those stories because they never wanted this to happen to another Native woman. They shared these stories because they wanted to see meaningful change. These shared those stories so their data could be the voice for women like me and other people like me. And now I had the opportunity to take the responsibility for those stories, for that dream, and move them forward. We spent time with the community. It took me more than 1.5 years to conduct the data analyses, have community meetings, set up what was going to be an appropriate way for us to release this information. When we released this information for the very first time in August of 2018, it was the front page of every newspaper in the country, because such rates of sexual violence had never been discussed, seen, or made visible ever before. One of the things that we found that was the hardest for many people to understand is that out of the 150 Native women we talked to, 94% of them had been raped or coerced into sex in their lifetime. I wish I had been surprised, but I wasn't. I have sat for many years with Native women, as this is one of my heart work. This is where my heart leads me. It is my passion. I've sat in groups with Native women across the country where we discuss not how to prevent the sexual assault of their daughters, of their sons, of their LGBTQ+ and non-binary loved ones. We sit in those circles and we talk about what we're going to do after the inevitable happens, and that is their sexual assaults. These stories have been being told within our communities for years. However, this data has never been valued and has never been taken seriously by those who are the ones who are supposed to enforce the safety and well-being of our communities. So for many years, I have stood in the halls of Congress of the United States. I have assisted tribal communities where their tribal leaders have cried out, they've yelled, they've marched, they've done everything they could to say our people are being traumatized in such a deep, horrible way. And this way, particularly sexual violence, was a tool of war that started more than 500 years ago. And despite all of those pushing for justice, our tribal leaders couldn't get the Department of Justice, the FBI, others to truly pay the attention that they needed to stop this horrific violence against our people. The direction from my elders was, if they won't do it for us, we have to do it for ourselves. Enforcement data, the peer-reviewed publications that we can't get access to because you have to pay for them, They're holding all of these things from us. When they do come in and they gather information on the rates of violence in our people, we never see it. It never comes back to us. It never hits our hands to where then we can use that as a tool for justice, to push, to ensure that our loved ones, our babies, that this isn't the inevitable outcome that we see for them. This is why my organization took this on. And in fact, all of the studies that I'll be talking about, we had no funding for. I self-funded them through speaking fees that I charge whenever I can. And we were able to, all of the work that I'm going to show you cost me less than $20,000. When I actually listened to a Department of Justice individual tell a tribal leader that it would cost millions for them to be able to figure out what was going on in our communities. It doesn't take millions. It takes a heart for justice and an understanding that these systems of institutional and structural racism have specifically created an environment where ongoing historical and generational trauma continues. Sexual violence being one of those. So we released this data. It was an incredible impact. It was in the hands of tribal leaders who began to push and began to move and began to make ask of my community at the Urban Indian Health Institute and I. But I want to share with you one thing in looking at this data. As I keep saying, actually, I'm not going to say anymore decolonizing data. I'm telling you the story of an Indigenous person who is living with my feet in the water, my soul's on the ground, my eyes to the mountain, the wind through my hair, a connection to our relations, both past, present, and future. My dream is part of decolonizing data, but I'm going to give you a very specific example right here. So in this graph, this beautiful ribbon skirt, a ribbon skirt is a traditional type of regalia, and ribbon skirts are a prayer skirt. Each ribbon is a prayer. When you put these skirts on, you are walking in the prayers of your people, and you are also part of the prayer for your people. So we thought about how we were going to represent this data. We wanted to ensure that we didn't trigger the community, that we provided as much support as possible, and that we encompassed it in what we know and why we release this information. And we know that we are praying for the good and well-being of our people moving forward. And we are also praying for the healing of our people backwards to the past, so that we can ensure the safety and well-being and greatest future for those next generations. So when I sent this out to my partners at the CDC, I was getting feedback because I wanted to be able to have this study influence funding opportunities that the CDC was going to release for American Indian, Alaska Native communities. And from multiple CDC partners, I got, wow, this is really cool. We like your cool graphic, but your data is represented weirdly. They're like, the science tells us that when you represent data, it needs to be in descending or ascending order. So smallest to largest or largest to smallest. And they're like, your data is out of order. And my answer to them was, I didn't do this for you. This data is not out of order. And in fact, we put the first ribbon at the top is near her hand. And it is that 94% who have been raped or coerced into sex in their lifetime. We know that when we care for each other, when we hold each other's hands, when we connect with one another, when we hold each other in prayer, we see healing. That is why that ribbon is at the top. And then as you kind of go through and you see the effects that these sexual assaults had on these women, at the very bottom, we have the 86% who reported being affected by historical trauma. So that's actually a really cool measure that we have that asks questions such as, do you feel a loss of land? It's all about connection to place and other historical injustices that, such as the boarding schools that our people have experienced. 86% of these women reported being affected by historical trauma. So why is the ribbon at the bottom? That's because in the teachings on ribbon skirts, when they touch the ground, Mother Earth knows that you are there, and you become connected to her and her healing, and it flows through you, and the prayers flow from not only from the earth to you, but from you down into that Mother Earth. That's why that ribbon was at the bottom. Data can be shared in a meaningful way that is for us, by us, and meaningful to us. And their science said that peoples don't understand this, but I told them and said, your science never included us. Your evidence-based practice on sharing data never included my people. This graphic has been so impactful across the nation. I will happen upon people and they have it as their screensavers. Numerous students have used it as their, for powwows when there was powwows prior to COVID. It has been very impactful to our community because it was built for us and by us. And it not only contained the graphical quantitative data, it also contained the connection to the spirit, to the culture, and to the community. And unless we are grounding ourselves back in that, we're not decolonizing anything. It wasn't until my organization was able to go back to our traditional value systems that says, yes, your director had a dream. And then my CEO said, I believe you. I know this to be real. I'm going to support you and move this forward in the way that is right for our people. When we go back to our traditional practices that are who we were always meant to be, who we still are, and who we will be in the future, that's the continuation of the ancestral consciousness that lives within me today, the blood memory that when I step on that earth, I feel the vibrations of my grandmother, my great-grandmother, my great-great-grandmother, and their strength flows through me in the days where I feel I have none. It is theirs that I feel as we move this fight forward. Because this study then begat another one, specifically on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. At the time, prior to November of 2018, again, our tribal leaders had been crying out for hundreds of years that our women were going missing and being murdered at astronomically high rates. The data that was held by the Department of Justice, by police departments, they kept saying, no, there is no problem. You only have a few stories. The stories that we told, the oral stories that hold such strength, such honor, such beauty, were disregarded because we did not have the quantifiable numbers that they wanted. However, what we discovered is they weren't gathering the numbers. The numbers didn't exist because the data systems that currently exist to gather the race and ethnicity of folks when they go missing, when they are murdered, when they are victims of violent crime and of crime generally, the data systems misclassify us. And in fact, for American Indians and Alaska Natives, we are misclassified approximately 40% in data records because people don't gather our race and ethnicity, or there's simply not a way for them to do it. And sometimes we have data systems, and this exists in law enforcement data systems. It's an area I'm working in right now, where the data systems will actually default to white if the race and ethnicity of folks isn't gathered. That happens in law enforcement data and health data and all kinds of data where race and ethnicity is gathered. They are defaulting people to white rather than asking their race and ethnicity. That default to white is an example of how white supremacy has embedded itself in a system that creates this institutional and structural racism that is effectively marginalizing and invisible, making us invisible within the data. For Native people, for Indigenous peoples, what does this mean for us to be invisible in the data? Well, for American Indian and Alaska Native communities whose treaties rely on tribal membership and having tribal people, when you eliminate us in the data, you are effectively participating in an active genocide against American Indian and Alaska Native people. When you eliminate us in the data, you are eliminating the federal trust responsibility that exists for federally recognized tribes for the resources that we agreed with the United States for them to, when they took our land and moved our people, those treaty rights are dependent on tribal members. They are dependent on census numbers. They're dependent, the census that was closed early by this administration. When you eliminate us in the data, you're eliminating the federal trust responsibility by making no more Native people left, American Indian, Alaska Native people left. And so this act, which is embedded now into data systems, is effectively eliminating us. And it takes the courage and it takes the tribal leaders who have stood, called, cried, those elders who have marched with their fists in the air, demanding visibility and justice. It is their work that has led the way for us to say, we're not going to accept this. We're going to do our own work. As an Indigenous scientist, I know that I come from thousands of years of Indigenous science. I know that when I publish this study, when I put up this data that they told me was out of order, I knew it was in order. And I felt the women standing behind me, of those ancestors who survived so that I could thrive. I'm a tangible manifestation of their resiliency. And with that comes the relationship to them and the responsibility to our community. So when we began to do the work on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, we released a study in November of 2018. It is still the only study that has ever been released on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in the United States ever. This study was released, and the data is in descending order because that's what made sense for us. We wanted to have the women and the average age in which those who went missing or were murdered, we wanted them to be in connection with the land. We found 506 cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in 71 cities across the United States. However, what we found more than anything is that we know a lot of nothing. And that's because police departments across the country simply didn't capture race and ethnicity. They defaulted to white. They did a number of things that effectively hid the number of missing and murdered Indigenous women that they had within their data sources. And in fact, out of this 506, my team and I found 151 cases that were not in the police records classified as Native. In one city, for example, in Anchorage, Alaska, we assisted that police department who worked with us. Not all police, most police departments did not appreciate what we were doing, but we actually reclassified correctly and made 9 Native women who had been murdered in Anchorage, Alaska. They were listed as white within those data systems. And we worked with the police department to reclassify them as Native women. As a result of this, this study and the last one, we have seen 15 pieces of legislation led by tribal communities, urban and rural, by those elders, by those women, by those young people who have been marching on the streets. They pushed for 15 different pieces of legislation in 12 different states. And we expect about 15 more pieces of legislation to pass in the next legislative session that cite this study. This one that came from a cry that I heard for 1.5 years prior to stepping into my office. We recently were part of passing 2 other pieces of federal legislation just a couple of weeks ago, Savannah's Act and the Not Invisible Act, that are the very first efforts to address this issue in the United States from a federal level. And it's just a first step. It's just the beginning. We refuse for our people to be invisible. And yet that is exactly what the data systems are doing to us. It takes an incredible amount of support from not only Indigenous communities, from allies across, to push these voices forward, to, when we walk in the room, to acknowledge that not only does Indigenous science exist, that in fact most Western science is built off of Indigenous science. And that when we come into these rooms, that there is a recognition that we bring intrinsic strength and knowledge, that we shouldn't have to go into these Western ideals and systems of pushing forward and having to make ourselves valid within these conversations. Unfortunately, that is the common experience. It needs to become more uncommon. And it's going to take allies within these communities at all levels to be part of doing that. And as part of that, we need to make sure that all data for Indigenous people, by Indigenous people, is accessible by Indigenous people. It shouldn't be held behind firewalls that cost $14.99 to access a journal. It shouldn't be the voices of communities who participated in research studies and peer-reviewed papers that they never actually ever get to see, that they never actually get to hold into their hands and feel the voices of those people who participated so that they could move forward into movements of justice. Our people have not had the opportunity nor the access. And it is going to take a radical move across all folks who interact with this kind of information to begin to look for other opportunities to ensure access for all people. So I think I want to close this, and I say close as in I'm a storyteller, so it's going to take a while. But I'm going to close with a story. This is my father, Howard Echo-Hawk. And when I talk about that cabinet and that experience, I can't explain that experience without telling you a story. So I want to tell you the story of my son, Miguel Echo-Hawk Lopez. He is just turned 20 years old. He is my greatest joy. So I moved to Seattle when I was 18 years old. I followed one of my siblings and came here to go to college. And soon after arriving here in Seattle, I became pregnant. And as a result of the trauma that I had experienced growing up, extreme sexual violence over the course of many years, the inability of be able to do anything about it as a result of the laws and the systems that exist in the United States, that when there's sexual violence on tribal lands, that it is, we know that about 60% of those are not prosecuted as a result of lack of resources from the Department of Justice. As a result of that, I grew up in really great trauma. I had a beautiful family. They loved me. They cared for me. I grew up in a very traditional way, and I'm very blessed and privileged. However, as a result of that trauma, I experienced the things that many of our young ones do. And in fact, many of the statistics that we have placed on our young ones were on me. Suicidality, substance misuse, behaviors that were not beneficial to my body, to my community. And when I arrived in Seattle and became pregnant, I had been experiencing for many years this level of trauma, and I was not in a good place. And I remember getting that pregnancy test back, and I was holding it in my hands, and I thought, can I live through this? Can I actually survive through this pregnancy and through having a child? And I remember those suicidal thoughts swimming through my mind about how could I even think about bringing another life into this world when mine was one that was destroying me at the time as a result of this trauma. And the thing that brought me back was how I was raised. I was raised with the women in my family in what we call our steam baths, kind of like a sweat. I was raised in knowing that I had a responsibility to the next generations, and I knew I had a responsibility to my child. Even as a very young woman, I knew my responsibility. And it was in my pregnancy that I began for the very first time to reach out to begin healing. I began to spend time with spiritual leaders. I began to spend time with my parents. I began to ask them questions and make everybody a little bit uncomfortable in bringing up this trauma that had never been addressed. We began to participate in spiritual and healing practices to bring our family back into balance. And so I was pregnant for 42 weeks. And if you're calculating that out, that's 10 and a half months. That is a really long time. But I know, and I always tell my son, he is who saved my life, because I was taught that when we as life bearers, as we birth our children, as we carry them within us in their very first water, that we are not only creating them, they are creating and healing us. So my son stayed with me for 42 weeks because he knew I needed him. So in that time that he stayed with me, and I can't tell you my son's story without telling you my story, and I can't tell you my story without telling you my father's story. So in the midst of this, after my son was born and I was sitting with him, he was about 3 weeks old. My father came to visit me in Seattle. We were sitting on a couch and he held his grandson for the very first time. As we were sitting there, he leaned over and he placed his head on my shoulder. He leaned his head right onto my shoulder, and he's a lot taller than me. It's kind of hard to do. And he said to me, he said, "Baby, I'm sorry." And he didn't have to tell me why he was saying that. I knew what it was. And I told him, "Dad, I forgive you." We never talked about it again on that trip, and he went home back to Alaska. And a couple months later, so my son's about 4 months old at this time, we're healing, we're growing together, we're enjoying this beautiful time. And my father, I pick up the phone and he says to me without saying another word, he says, "Baby, I'm sorry." I told him, "Oh, Dad, I forgive you." And he hung up. A couple months later, I get another call. "Baby, I'm sorry." It's like, "Oh, Dad, I forgive you." And I hung up. This went on for about 7 years. He would call me every couple of months out of the blue, and he would say, "Baby, I'm sorry. And I would say, Dad, I love you. I forgive you. About 8 years into this, I've got an 8-year-old running around, wild, incredible, beautiful little boy. And I pick up the phone and it's my father again. And he says, baby, I love you. Baby, forgive me. And I told him, Dad, I forgive you. And you don't have to call me anymore. I forgive you, and I know, and I am in a good place, and my baby is in a good place, and I am healing. And it was quiet on the other line. And then he said to me, he said, baby, I need to call you. And it was at that very moment, for the very first time, that I realized that as I was healing forward for my son, my dad was healing backwards for his father and his grandfather. My dad was raised on the Pawnee Reservation. He was deeply impacted by the boarding schools where they took our children away, his father away, his grandfather away. They put them in a school in the middle of the reservation where they didn't see their parents for 9 months. When their kids were little, how they used to punish the little ones is they would hang them in little burlap sacks in the basement overnight if they misbehaved. It was incredibly cruel. And as a result of that, my father grew up in great trauma. And I didn't realize that in my healing, my dad was healing. And he was healing his father. As we talk about the reclamation of who we are as Indigenous peoples, the knowledge systems that exist, our healing is backwards and forwards, and our knowledge is never linear. Knowledge is circular and it is iterative. And it flows from ancestors from 500 years ago to the future ancestors 500 years in the future. My father and I, we are the story of my son. We are the story of the incredible nature that we get to be a part of. So in the midst of doing all of this work on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, sexual violence, all of the other work that I'm so blessed to do, it is very hard. For everybody here who is a non-Indigenous person, I want you to understand that as Native people, as Indigenous peoples in these systems, we fight every single day for the lives of our people. We fight the institutional and structural racism. We fight the blatant racism. We fight the erasure of our people. And we do it willingly. We do it with love. We do it with support of our community, but it is also not without its costs. And those costs are often our own mental health, our own self-care. And one of the things that I struggled with when I was doing and continue to do this work is that as a survivor of sexual violence, I can be triggered by the work that I'm doing. And after the release of our Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report, I knew I needed to go home. I needed to go back to Alaska. I needed to stand on my land. I needed to hear the accents, what we call village accents of my relatives. And I needed to go back to a plant. So what you're seeing here is a picture of the Alaska blueberry. Where I'm from in Alaska, it is both the coldest and the hottest. It gets to 100 degrees, and it also got to negative 72 degrees last year. It's very cold and very hot. This particular plant for my people, the blueberry, is one that Western science has looked at, and this particular blueberry has some of the highest antioxidants and vitamins that exist in a berry anywhere in the world, is this one. And it's one that I grew up eating, knowing that first it went to the elders, then it went to the youth, and it went to those who were in need of nutrients. And I also was taught when I would go out to the blueberry fields that when we would go out, we would gather. And when you gather, you offer a prayer, you lay down a gift, and you sing songs, and you sing them really loud. Now, the song singing is also because there's bears, and the louder you are, the less likely you are to have a bear attack you. But the song singing is also a song to the plants. It's one of gratitude. It's one of thankfulness for what they are gifting to us and what we give to it. And for me, I see myself, and I know I am a blueberry. I have survived some of the most horrific things, but I have been able to step into the healing and wholeness to create the beauty that lies within that plant. And so when we talk about the science and the nutrition, which I am really blessed to work in chronic disease prevention across the nation, is we can't do that without talking about, as Native people, our connection to the plants. And that for me, I had to go back home in order to be able to do the research work, to be able to do the data, to be able to do the analysis, to do the advocacy, to stand in front of members of Congress and state legislatures across the country. In order to do that, I had to go back to a plant and I had to pick berries. And so that's what I did. Before I went to Congress, I went back to Alaska and I stood in the blueberry fields with my son, because that is his story, with my son, Miguel Echo-Hawk Lopez, in this beautiful part of Alaska where he's standing in the midst of blueberries. We gathered, we sang, we offered prayers, we reconnected to the land. And for him, the most beautiful part about this story is that this is just normal. It's just who he is. It's just part of his being. And I think about when I was his age and if it could have been that for me. When I talk about decolonizing data, it is his face that I see. It is the face of my niece and my nephews. It is the face of the children who have yet to see my great-grandchildren, my great-great-grandchildren. It is connection to land and to earth. And when I see this child, this one who, when I held him in my arms when he was born, and I pressed my face against his, and we exchanged his first breath together, that's where healing was. That's where the suicidality disappeared. That's where the substance misuse found a path where I could find a way forward. How is that measured and where is that in the data? That first exchange of sacred breath with one another. What measures matter and who decides what matters? Because often when they talk about teenagers who are like myself, experiencing suicidality, who were experiencing substance misuse, who had a lot of other unhealthy behaviors, we don't often talk about how we survived, how we made it, that we even made it into that next day. And when I think about my son who hasn't had to live through the things that I did because of a world that was different, because of the healing that I did, that my father did, and that my father's father and his ancestors were doing all at the same time, that is the health and well-being that we see for our children moving forward. Very often, we are described as Indigenous peoples as a historically underserved community. That's not true. I come from a history of ancestors who prayed for me, who whispered prayers when those prayers were outlawed, who sang songs when they could have been killed for simply continuing to speak their language, who passed down stories so I could tell them to my son and he could tell them to his children. I am not historically underserved. I am colonially underserved. I am institutionally underserved, but I am historically resilient. We are a tangible manifestation of our ancestors' resiliency. Ancestors who did more than survive, they created environments that we could thrive, ever continuing. That is the legacy that we have this incredible opportunity to live forward. Decolonizing is not a metaphor. It's an action. And it is one that has to be coming from Indigenous peoples, led by our voices, led by our knowledge systems. I told you the work that we have been able to do and the incredible impact it has had on this country, not because I'm bragging about myself at all. In fact, I want to give all gratitude to the families, to all of the members of my team, to everybody who put these efforts forward. But I will tell you, it would not have happened. We would not have had 2 pieces of federal legislation happen if I hadn't been listening to the spiritual dream that was gifted to me that I had seen for a year and a half. As Indigenous peoples, we have to challenge the Western norms that say these kinds of things are out of the ordinary. I don't want your ordinary. I want to be a Pawnee Athabascan woman whose eyes are always forward on the mountains, whose feet are always in the water, whose hands are always holding those of my relatives, of my ancestors, past, present, and future. This is the opportunity that we have. And unless we're acknowledging that these knowledge systems exist and that there are Western structural institutions that are inhibiting our people from accessing data that could be used in this meaningful way, we have to acknowledge that this is happening if we are going to see true movement forward and healing. So that the Miguel Echo-Hawk Lopez's of the world, my niece Te Rangamo Awawai, my niece Zoe Echo-Hawk, all of these babies should have the greatest future, and we have the opportunity to move forward. And that is what true equity is. If you are not being uncomfortable in your equity efforts, you're probably doing them wrong. Because equity is uncomfortable, it is not voluntary, but it is the picture of the community that we want to be. It builds that beautiful community forward. And it is in the lives of these beautiful young ones, standing connected to their land, knowing who their place is within their family, their tribes, their communities. That is where we are going to see the healing come from. And this is my favorite thing to say, is that people need to quit coming to us because they think we have all of the problems. They need to come to us because we have all of the answers. You just haven't been listening. We know what is needed within our community. We know how to move into healing. And we honor those who have held on to these cultures and these traditions so that we can move forward to the healing. And we also know we carry them in our land and in our very DNA, the blood memories of those who came before us. Their voices still speak through ours. Their actions happen with our hands. They walk in our feet. Come to us because we have all of the answers, not because you think we have all of the problems. It's going to take reciprocal partnerships, and it's going to take things like redefining what you think things are. So I'm just going to flip through these. You can find these on my website, UIHI.org, under our Urban Indian Dictionary. We have redefined for my organization what these words mean and how we apply them to the work that we do for science evaluation and any kind of data analysis. Because what we are doing is we are moving towards healing. We are taking all of these pieces they tried to break apart for us, and instead we're stitching them back together, and we're stitching them back together with sacred things like cedar and sweetgrass from my traditions. We are building them into beautiful, strong, intricate patterns of healing, wellness, and wholeness, grounded in who we are. But what it takes is bravery. And every single day I wake up and I think, am I going to be brave enough today to challenge this next system? And what I know about bravery in my community is that I am not courageous or brave by myself. I am those things because of my siblings, because of my family, because of my ancestors who stand with me. I'm not an individual, I am part of a community, and I am brave because of them. And it is going to take that bravery, particularly those of allies who are looking to support Indigenous voices, Indigenous knowledge systems, and just ways of knowing. You're going to have to step out of what you're comfortable in, and you're going to have to practice bravery too. Are you part of those systems that surround an Indigenous person, an Indigenous community, and moving forward into the health, wellness, and healing that their ancestors survived for them to have? How big is your brave? And how are you going to move forward in building that healing today? I'm going to close quickly. I don't know if we have any relatives from Aotearoa on the call on this, but in my community, and I know that when I spent time in my brother-in-law's community in Aotearoa, in closing with a song, and I want to close with a song that honors those women I talked about, the missing and murdered, those that have been sexually assaulted. When I spoke their stories and I told you their truth, they're here with us, and I want to honor them. They're here with us virtually. They're here with me in this office. I feel them around me every single day. I feel their hands touch mine. I feel their hair lean onto me when we touch foreheads and breathe air together. They're with me, and I want to honor them with closing with this song, and in gratitude for all of you today for sitting and listening to my story, just of one Indigenous person, of one community, of one organization, it does not represent that of all. Our stories are diverse, our stories are different, and they all matter, they all have value, and they all are grounded in knowledge that many people can't even imagine. So in gratitude to all of you today, and to those women whose voices, whose spirits are here with us right now. Atias, atias, idi ati kadu, idi hamaki badu. Atias, atias, idi hamaki badu. Oh, thank you.
Mahalo, Abigail. I think I speak for a few, if not all of us, and that I'm just still processing all of that ike that you just shared with us, and that mo'olelo. I appreciate you sharing about the role of dreams and knowledge and meaning making and revealing kuleana, as you shared in your mo'olelo or your story today. And for reminding us again, as with the presenters that we've heard from yesterday, about the importance of connecting to Aina, to land, and to other kupuna as well. Mahalo for your mo'olelo and your bravery in sharing your stories with us today, and really exemplifying the power of story for all of us in more ways than one. Also want to mahalo you for continuing to, as you said, step into the beauty and walk into these rooms with the strength of your kupuna, your elders, to shine light and raise consciousness around the historical trauma that Indigenous people continue to battle today and move forward to the reclamation and the healing backwards and forwards. Beautiful, beautiful way of explaining it. And I also want to share gratitude to you for reminding us today again about our relations to Aina, to land, and to all Indigenous peoples, as reminders of who we are, as you started in the beginning, of who we are and who we're responsible to. Our mo'okuaho, our genealogies also tell us of this relationality. And our mo'olelo, our stories tell us of the resiliency and bravery of our ancestors, which, as you pointed out, they have passed on to us and we carry them with us every day. Mahalo, mahalo, mahalo. And with that, if anyone has any questions for Abigail, I know you might still be sitting with a lot of this. Take your time, but please, if anyone has any questions, you're welcome to put those into the Q&A or in the chat. I'll just give it a second. We do have some questions, but I'll give it a second for any BIPOC folks who have questions as well. So one of the questions is the route of politics, i.e. going to Congress to demand better services and understanding, the most effective way to make things better? Or can we make change through talking to scientists? And if so, are they starting to listen? And this question coming from Deborah Lee.
It has to be happening at both levels. Right now for American Indians, Alaska Natives, and I will say that this excludes those that are non-federally recognized tribes, and I want to acknowledge those are tribal people simply because they're not federally recognized by the government. That is, again, erasure by the US government. But because of the unique relationship of federally recognized tribes with the US government, we have to go to Congress because that's where the laws are made. The states cannot apply in the same, or can't do the same things that Congress does. So for some things, we have to go to Congress. So when I talked about the laws that exists currently right now, that so for many tribal reservations, for offenders of crime, for most crimes, they can't prosecute non-Indians. So they can only prosecute Native people who do crimes on Native land. But say generally 90%, we know 90% of the assaults that happen on Indian land are from white men. They can't prosecute them. It has to be prosecuted by the Department of Justice, not by the states. And so we have to go to Congress for some of those things. but see so many active scientists within the science world, and in every area. I mean, every single area, there is just some Indigenous person that when I hear them speak, I'm like, whoa, like, let me follow you on Twitter or something, who are making change in every single area. That is one of the most beautiful things I've seen happen in the last 15 years. And I always say, like, I went and got my Western education because my grandma Katie John from Antasta, she told us, you have to know how to fight in the white man's world. You don't live in it, and you don't have to live in it, but you have to know how to fight within it. And when I went into school and started getting into the science world, and I realized that most Western science was based on the science my grandma taught me, who never even went to high school, Western high school, I'm like, okay, we know where this is from, but we're changing it in all levels. So for federally recognized tribes, we have to go to Congress. It's just the way that the system is set up. But we have people in every single level working to break down systems and not waiting anymore. There was a point in time where our people were just surviving, and I am so grateful to that survival. We have an opportunity as these generations to step into what they didn't have an opportunity to do, and that is to push and demand justice and demand change. And we're seeing that in every single level.
For sure. I like how you were talking earlier about demanding visibility, and what you're saying about the role of government and researchers in holding data and publications and, you know, maintaining these barriers to access. Which brings me to another question raised about, do you have any advice that you might share for those of us in the audience who are librarians or knowledge caretakers who aren't producing the data, but are the ones, you know, responsible for providing access to that data?
Yeah, so my organization, we're a small nonprofit in Seattle, and I remember when I left the university, I was like, oh man, now I'm not gonna have access to all these journals that I've had access to for how long? And so we have some, like, for example, my organization has minimal access through our relationship with the Indian Health Service, but I don't have access to all the information that I need, when in fact, my organization is producing a majority of the information right now related to Native people, Indigenous people living in urban settings. And so we formed a relationship with folks in the different libraries in this area. And they would we would send them what our, journal articles we needed, and then they would send them back to us. And the only way we had that relationship is they reached out to us. Initially, we were just kind of like, okay, who has a student who has access to, to these information? And that was a real starting point for me to think about, how can folks use their power, privilege, and access and reach out to communities and offer services. You're not coming in some like white savior horse thing, but coming in and offer your services. How can you serve that community and do it in relationship with them with what they need? And so this was something we needed, and now we have, as a result of folks who are non-Indigenous people who had access to these information systems, who reached out and established a relationship and partnership with us. And now we've provided training for them on the different things that we're doing. And we have this bi-directional partnership. And we look at tribes across the country, and also for our Native youth and others who are looking to have this access, they simply don't even know how to get it. It seems so difficult. And that's one of the things that we've seen multiple different agencies work on, is how do we get our people this access? It's going to take innovation. It's going to take thinking about where in your own organizations there are structural barriers that don't need to be there. It's going to be challenging the common perceptions of how things are supposed to be done, to be able to undo systems of inequity. So when we think about access, you have to recognize it as a barrier that was put in place to ensure that white folks had access to information and marginalized communities of color did not. It was based on who could get into the education system, who had the money to pay for it, who had the money to pay for what they couldn't access if they couldn't access university systems. So these systems have been built and have based their financial structures even on having that information, that money, those resources. That's what institutional structural racism looks like. So you have to start at the core of it, recognize where it's at, And what are your opportunities to undo those systems? As somebody who worked in academia for a really long time, and I was really blessed to be part of putting little holes in the system, start putting those holes in. You can do it. You know, there are opportunities to challenge. There are opportunities to, like, these incredible folks who are making sure my team gets the information and journals that we need and articles that we need that we wouldn't have access to otherwise. Where can you put the holes in the system so we can break down that wall and it can crumble into nothing?
I just, the people next to me must be wondering why I keep shouting yes and preach all the time. So mahalo again for putting that. We have another question about the data that your organization is putting out and wondering if that data is being archived as well.
Well, that is actually what the previous speaker from yesterday, Sandy. Those are some conversations that we're going to be having with them. One of the things that we have been practicing, and I suggest if you're not aware of this term to get to know it very well, and that is Indigenous data sovereignty. So there are Indigenous data sovereignty networks. I sit on the board for the one in the United States. It really started in New Zealand, Aotearoa, and there is one in Australia. And what we're in the United States, we really look at under both federal and international treaty law of the United States, when we acknowledge the sovereignty of Indigenous peoples and communities, under sovereignty is data. And data sovereignty means that we govern, we ensure that is collected in a good way, and that we know that the data is being used for the good and well-being of our people. And so we're in the midst of pushing the Indigenous data sovereignty to the forefront. And making sure that, you know, particularly the United States has always used data against us. It was always showing how bad off they are. They want to show the suicidal youth. They don't want to show me. You know, it's the deficit-based narrative that is used with institutional data from a Western concept that always looks at problems and deficits versus looking at strengths and resiliencies. So my people in the census of 1910, so there was an estimate that in 1830, the first military groups that came across the Pawnee Nation, we were estimated at 48,000 people. Census of 1910, there was 633 of us left. My ancestor was number 534 on the census data. We are survivors in a place that wanted to completely eliminate us. And as a result of that, the inherent strength, how did we survive? We wouldn't be here if we didn't have such inherent strengths and knowledge systems that were maintained in the midst of a genocide. That's what needs to be acknowledged, and we need to lead with those. So if you see data come out of my organization, we lead with the strengths, we identify the gaps, and we also look towards what the solutions are going to be through the Indigenous knowledge systems that exist within community.
Well, I know we're getting close to time, but if I may, I just want to put in this last question. There's a question about whether your organization offers training to non-Native allies, i.e. white librarians, but I wonder if you might talk generally also just about actually anything you might want to share with that group.
Yeah, so we do offer a number of different trainings. You can sign up for our newsletter at uihi.org and get information about those trainings. And we're very specific about when they are for non-Indigenous folks and when they're directed towards our community. So for example, my organization has an Indigenous evaluation framework. It's the very first one in the country done for urban Indian communities who don't have the same legal rights that tribes do. And so people are like, you know, every time we put out the announcement for it, we're inundated. I'm like, unless you are Indigenous and you work for Indigenous organizations, you're not coming, because I need to make sure that our people get access to what has been taken from us. And so we definitely balance that. So there are opportunities that are open for everybody. And then we hold very dear and prioritize those for Indigenous peoples, but we recognize we have to do both. And in addition to that, you know, like when it comes to Indigenous folks, you know, we do everything we can to provide the resources. And then when we think about our Indigenous knowledge systems, we also expect that we will be valued in our voices. Let's tell a quick story to end this. I was standing in a circle maybe 2 years ago, and I had been asked to do something that seemed important. And I'm standing in a circle and I'm with all white men, and they hand us all cards at the end of it, and they're opening, they're like, thank everybody for coming. And the guy was like, oh, they gave me $1,000, the guy next to me. And I opened up my card and it was a $20 gift certificate to Starbucks. And so one of the things that we are also very cognizant of is that our time, our voice, and our knowledge is valuable. And it should be compensated in a way that allows us to move our work forward. So for example, all the work that I just talked about was funded off of speaking fees that I charge. You know, it wouldn't have happened. National change wouldn't have happened if I hadn't done that. So we're also looking to ensure that Indigenous voices are valued. And we know that Black, Indigenous, people of color, when we go and we speak places, we are not given the same financial compensation as others. And then we add gender into that, and it gets worse. So that's another structural inequity that we as both allies and community members can be part of addressing and ensuring that there is equity in voice and equity in the way that that voice is valued.
Again, mahalo for sharing that with all of us, and for sharing all of your mo'olelo today. I'm glad you were able to share another one. I'd like to invite everyone to please join me in sharing their mahalo, and wherever you may be joining us from today, you can enter that into the chat or just share your mahalo with Abigail. We'd like to ask you to share your reflections on this session by completing this session evaluation, and you can find that, it'll be linked in the chat, and we'll also be sending this out to you. But please, e hoʻike mai ko mana'o, so that we can continue to build out this program and presentation for others. We hope that you can join us at 12 o'clock for Lesa's presentation, and she'll also be closing out the symposium. And lastly, I want to again, mahalo, Abigail, and all of you for joining us today. And again, invite you, the session may be ending, but please continue to sit with the mana'o and the ike that were shared with us today. And as Abigail encouraged us to do, take action on all of these things. So mahalo ya o kou pakahia pau. Ahui ho.